Hey, fake footballers. Welcome to the Week 7 Starts and Sits. I am your host, Greg Smith, at Greg Sauce on Twitter. We will start, as always, by reviewing our picks from Week 6. And let's kick things off with the quarterbacks. Starts, Sam Bradford, disappointed, QB 25, only about 10 points. Otherwise, we did okay. Jay Cutler, QB 13, Bortles, QB 5, Tannehill, not great, QB 20, but he still got 16 points, which is usable, and I only had him ranked 13th. Kaepernick was a nice hit. He was QB 7 on the week, 22.6 points. On the sit side, we'll start with E.J. Manuel at the bottom and work our way up to this train wreck of a Phillip Rivers pick. But Manuel, QB 10, over 20 points. I was a little worried that, he just wouldn't be able to fill in those shoes of Tyrod Taylor, and I still don't think he can do that fully, and I'm not completely on board with trusting him this week, although the matchup is good in Jacksonville, or in London against Jacksonville, rather. But, yeah, I feel like the process on avoiding Manuel last week was fine, and I don't think you would have had to face many owners starting him. So this QB 10 ranking is a little bit misleading, because he was probably only started in very dire circumstances, and therefore, if you had, for example, Jay Cutler, who finished his QB 13, if you started him over Manuel, it's unlikely that your opponents would have been starting Manuel. So Jay Cutler was ostensibly QB 12 in that situation. This is, of course, all the grand rationalization to excuse myself from not tabbing E.J. Manuel as a viable fantasy option last week, but we do what we can, and I do think the process on avoiding him last week was good. Kirk Cousins, Alex Smith, Peyton Manning, all pretty decent calls. Smith was fine, 16.3 points, right there with Tannehill. But Manning and Cousins both disappointed, under 10 points, and so those were good calls. Phillip Rivers, what happened? Well, I'm going to argue that the process here was okay as well. I do remember one distinct point while I was watching this game where the Packers dropped a surefire interception, like right at the goal line or in the end zone even, that Rivers threw, and the guy should have caught it. He didn't. Regardless, though, this is one case where I probably outthought myself with Rivers. The home away splits seemed good. The defensive metrics of the Green Bay passing defense, versus Rivers, seemed to be lining up to where this was a solid call. I had Phillip Rivers ranked as my QB 15. So I'm not saying he was completely unusable, and I'm sure plenty of people started him in spite of my recommendation. But in general, I think playing from behind against Green Bay, and just in general with the Chargers, where their running game is kind of a mess, Rivers is going to have to chuck it a lot, and the volume alone is going to make him playable most weeks. And so I definitely overthought this against Green Bay, and we'll try to avoid that going forward. Let's go now to the running backs. TJ Yeldon didn't play. He was hurt. I know that in the article it was mentioned that he was questionable. Thanks to the editors on that one. But in general, he didn't play. We're not going to count him. Lamar Miller and LeGarrette Blount were great calls. Both finished inside the top 10 among running backs. I do think Blount in general, there's this perception that you have to choose every week whether it's going to be a LeGarrette Blount game or a Dion Lewis game, and I'm kind of the mind that there is no such thing. I think that every week is a LeGarrette Blount week and every week is a Dion Lewis week, if only because that Patriots offense is so good and because the running back position has been annihilated by injuries and platoons. I understand that Blount and Lewis are in a platoon themselves, but each guy, when they've played, in a game together, has been usable every week. Lewis wasn't great last week. He scored 5 or 6 points, but that's not going to totally murder you like a 0 point or a 1.9 week. Like, hello, Charkandrick, how are you? I'm fine. I wish you didn't blow it last week. Anyway, Blount, kind of every week starter status for me at this point, just based upon the landscape of the running back position. But we'll get to more on that later because he's going to be a start again this week. Javorius Allen, yeah, I was a little worried about the Forsett injury, and normally leading up to game time, you hear the reports on Forsett saying, okay, well, it's iffy or he's going to play, but he's not 100%. And that was why Allen stayed ranked as high as he did, RB 29. I thought they'd still mix him in a fair amount. He only scored 2.1 points, finished as RB 30. That wasn't a great call. I do think that Allen is not a bad stash candidate, just in case Forsett does re-injure himself. But it looks like Forsett is fine for now, and we can kind of move forward, considering him, back to where he was as a viable RB2 and fringe RB1 in some weeks. We talked about Shirkandrick. He did not do very well. David Johnson was admittedly a bit of a risk to choose him in that 3 running back attack that Arizona employs. He only scored 1.7 points, did not live up to my ranking of 28th at the running back position. Theo Riddick, on the other hand, I said was a PPR play, and as with the previous week in Charles Sims, Riddick was usable in standard leagues as well. He scored 7.8 points, finishes RB21. This is what I'm talking about with running backs. The fact that Theo Riddick is an RB1, despite ceding so much work to Amir Abdullah and now, in theory, Joique Bell, once Bell returns, it just goes to show you that kind of every week you need to pick which guy from all the platoons is going to perform. And this week I chose Theo Riddick. It happened to pay off. I did, stipulate that was more of a PPR call. But in these big committees, these 3-back committees, the PPR guys are probably the most appealing, if only because they have those guaranteed touches and those game flow independent touches for if and when the offense gets behind. These are the running backs who are going to see playing time, and these are the guys you're going to want to target out of those committee backfields. On the sit side, Abdullah, he was fine. He had almost 7 points, finishes RB23, but that's right about in line where I ranked him, RB25. And again, we're kind of looking just beyond the top 24, just beyond starter status or RB1 status in a 12-team league, which is why he was a sit. He ended up finishing as an RB1, unfortunately, for me. Same goes with CJ Anderson. Him and Hillman both, performed pretty well in what was a good matchup. I was just worried that they would eat too much into each other's targets and carries. So, maybe it's just as long as Peyton Manning sucks. These guys are guys you have to consider using in your flex positions. Crowell was a fine call, RB36 versus a ranking of 32. Matt Jones didn't play. Jonathan Stewart, man, basically my Phillip Rivers of the running backs review here. He crushed it. He went for 20.6 points, finished as RB5. I had him ranked outside of the top 35 at the position, so that's pretty ugly. And I don't feel as good about him this week going against Philly. Philly's defense is a lot stronger, but I was pretty convinced that Stewart wouldn't be able to perform against Seattle either. So I don't know. Maybe we need to reconsider how we thought about Jonathan Stewart. I kind of think that this is an outlier week, if only because Cam Newton's still going to vulture a lot of goal line carries, and teams facing the Panthers are going to try to force that offense to beat them through the air. They're going to try to stop Stewart and Cam from running the ball, but that's definitely speculation, definitely hearsay, so we won't dwell too much on that, but just know that Stewart isn't going to be an RB5 or top 5 running back every week. Wide receivers are next. Moncrief and Decker were fine calls. Willie Snead was a poor call. I think I was recording this video last week right as the Thursday game was going on. I tend to record during Thursday Night Football. Usually you don't miss much. Those games aren't great. But anyway, Snead didn't do too great. 5.5 points isn't terrible, but again, not what you want from a flex play. You want to shoot a little higher than that. Kamar Aiken did okay. He finished as wide receiver 43, but still put up 8 points. And that's, kind of a basement of a flex play that I'd be willing to deal with. Marquez Wilson, I glossed over him. This was more of a call for if Alshon Jeffrey sat out. Jeffrey played. Jeffrey looks awesome. He's probably a top 12 wide receiver going forward. Marquez Wilson still, garnered enough targets to put up 5 fantasy points. Not great, but right in line where I had him ranked after the news that Alshon was going to be playing came out. Josh Huff, not a great call. I've grayed him out here because he did leave this game at some point with an injury. It looked like some sort of leg injury, maybe a knee injury. And he did come back. He didn't miss too much time in the game, but I do think that scare might have led him to play a little tentatively. I might be giving myself a little bit too much credit here by graying it out instead of just calling it what it was, which is a bad call. But he didn't do too much in place of Nelson Aguilar, and now Aguilar's a week closer to being healthy, so Huff again is just kind of gonna be a lottery ticket, a boom bust play. Speaking of a lottery ticket that paid off, Stephon Diggs, wide receiver 16 with almost 13 points, outperformed what I expected. I had him ranked 36th, but I'll take it. That worked out well. On the sit side, T.Y. Hilton finishes wide receiver 15. I thought that he would be the inferior play to Moncrief. He finished, one spot ahead of him, so they were right about equal. And this is another situation probably similar to what I was dealing with Phillip Rivers against Green Bay. I think I overthought the notion to sit T.Y. Hilton against the Patriots offense. I think that any wide receivers that you have, especially talented guys like Hilton, like Moncrief, talented guys like that going against really high-powered offenses like that of the Patriots, like that of the Green Bay Packers, those sorts of receivers are going to have opportunities, and they're not going to face the same risks that quarterbacks facing those high-powered offenses are, because these wide receivers are not going to throw interceptions like the quarterbacks potentially can. And that's not to say that Luck was a bad play either. I mean, he was fine. But, let's say, for example, that the Washington professional football team were to face the Patriots. Pierre Garçon is probably still a start in that case, if only because Washington's going to have to chuck it to keep up. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Kirk Cousins is a start, because if the Patriots know that Washington has to throw it, if they're forcing that sort of game script or game flow, that presents more risk for the quarterback in terms of turnovers. So something to keep in mind. I think I overthought this Hilton pick, and we'll try to avoid that sort of thinking going forward. Alan Hearns, not a great call, not a terrible call. He did finish below where I ranked him, but he scored 9 points. I mean, that's fine. Pierre Garçon, similar. I had him ranked 33. He finished 39 with 8.8 points. These were more, keep these guys out of your top 24 type of picks. Travis Benjamin, wide receiver 20 with 11.7 points. That was a pretty bad call. He appears to be a little bit matchup proof, as terrifying as that sounds to say. He'll see a pretty good test this week against St. Louis, and I think you can use him if you have him. Again, if only because the difference between, wide receiver 20 and wide receiver 39 is, 2 points, 3 points, 11.7 versus 8.8. You're kind of rolling the dice at that point once you're outside of the top 24. Percy Harvin didn't play. Ted Ginn was a nice call. He finished as wide receiver 80. He's got another tough matchup this week against Philly. Michael Floyd, so much for letting the Wookiee win. He did just fine, finished right inside that wide receiver 2 threshold at wide receiver 24 with 11 points. If he's going to be more involved in that offense, man, look out for the Cardinals, because they are super deep, super talented. Carson Palmer is probably a top 5 quarterback going forward if Floyd is going to remain involved and remain good at what he does. So we'll keep that in mind as well. Tight ends. Gary Barnidge, unstoppable, man. Tight end 3, almost 16 points. That was a nice call. Jordan Cameron finished right where I had him ranked. Tight end 10, 9 points. Crockett Gilmore wasn't a great call. He still finished inside the top 24 with, a meager 3 points. But Ladarius Green did pay off. Tight end 8 with 9.5 points. I mean, look, Keenan Allen's hurt now. Green is going to be a guy that you can use pretty much every week. Antonio Gates is missing practices this week as well. So don't sleep on Ladarius going forward. He could be a guy that, could give you some sneaky value at the tight end position. Charles Clay, good call, telling you to avoid him in terms of staying outside of the top 12, 6.2 points. Kyle Rudolph similarly finished as tight end 14 with 7 points. Heath Miller and Owen Daniels were both pretty bad. This is solid. I'll take it. That's right about what I expected. All right, with the review out of the way, let's get to the Flobotics spreadsheet, the new and improved Game Flobotics spreadsheet. As you can see, I've shifted some of the stuff around here. I've moved the DVOA rankings around a bit. I've included Football Outsiders ranks for offensive and defensive lines in terms of pass protection and run blocking. And I've also listed all players who are associated with an offense, fantasy relevant, and maybe even digging a little too deep in some cases. I have Garrett Selleck listed here under the Niners, which, makes sense when Vernon Davis is questionable or probable. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. The point is that instead of just outlining specific players to start and sit, which I'm going to continue to do, and that'll remain here on the spreadsheet, I wanted to, kind of like we talked about last week, show that if I think Colin Kaepernick is a sit, you can look at who else is related to him in that offense, Anquan Boldin, Torrey Smith, Vernon Davis, and see who else might be affected by, a stingy Seahawks defense, for example. So let me know what you think of the new layout. I hope you like it. We're still looking at lines, spreads, over-unders. We have injuries here. I've implemented a new box up here to tell you when the lines were updated and when the injuries were updated. In both cases here, these were last updated yesterday for me, which was Wednesday, October 21st. So keep all that in mind. Be sure to check out, the in-depth stuff at Football Outsiders if you have questions about what any of these are. These aren't quite DVOA rankings on the offensive and defensive line statistics. These are adjusted sack rate for pass line play and adjusted line yards for rushing line play. So without further ado, let's jump into our first relevant matchup for the weekend, Buffalo and Jacksonville. Buffalo heavy favorites here in a London game. This one's early. They're broadcasting on Yahoo, which is pretty sweet. Low total, 42 points. We can look at, what's going on here in the DVOA, and in general, I think the stuff to take away here is that Jacksonville is pretty good against the run, 10th in DVOA, or 10th in adjusted line yards against on defense, 6th in rushing defense DVOA, and that the Buffalo offense is, pretty decent. They have the 7th ranked passing offense. They have the 12th ranked rushing offense. These numbers are inherently tied in some way to Tyrod Taylor, but it sounds like he's going to play in this game. If he's not 100%, that could be a problem. But in general, I think if we can assume that if he's playing, they're going to be pretty okay. Get into the starts and sits. I like Blake Bortles. It's a little bit counterintuitive with this 10th ranked Buffalo passing defense. But with that said, the adjusted sack rate for Buffalo is only 29th, so it's not like they're really pressuring QBs too much. So I do think that Bortles will have a little bit of time. And with the injuries to TJ Yeldon, I do believe that Jacksonville is incentivized to throw a little bit more. And, because the Jags defense is pretty bad in the first place, 27th, 28th ranked overall, depending upon which metric you want to use, I have a feeling that Jacksonville is going to be playing from behind here, whether EJ Manuel or Tyrod Taylor start. I think obviously the chances of Buffalo being good are better if Tyrod starts. Anyway, I do think that Buffalo is going to put up points. Bortles is going to have to pass, as usual, with this team to keep up. And we've seen that leads to fantasy success for him in previous weeks. I don't know if he's going to be, a top 5 QB like he has been in recent weeks, but I do think top 12 is reasonable, especially considering some of the other options at the quarterback position this week. Speaking of offense for the Bills, a couple guys I like, Robert Woods and Charles Clay. Both are starts for me. These are both very much tied to the fact that Percy Harvin and Sammy Watkins are, not looking good to play in this game or be 100% at least. So I like these other options in the Buffalo passing game. If you want to dig a little deeper, Chris Hogan is a name to keep in mind. And based on the relatively strong Jacksonville rushing defense, I'm not going to specifically recommend LaShawn McCoy this week, but he's probably a top 15 guy anyway, just based on the attrition at running back. Let's go next to Tampa Bay and Washington. Washington 3.5-point favorites here. Another relatively low total, 43 points. What's going on here? The Washington defense still pretty good. 11th ranked in DVOA, 13th if you want to account for preseason projections. But Tampa Bay's defense has been pretty decent too. They're ranked 15th overall, and in particular, their rushing defense is pretty strong. They rank 11th in terms of DVOA. Passing defense, not quite as good, 24th in DVOA, and for that reason, I do like the Washington passing game in this matchup to some extent. I don't love Kirk Cousins particularly, but I like Pierre Garçon. If you want to dig a little deeper, Jamison Crowder is a guy you can use, and I'm not super sold on the tight ends here. Jordan Reed, Derek Carrier, if one or both of them play, Tampa Bay has been fairly stingy against the tight end position, so I would look rather to the wide receivers on Washington and go that route. One other guy to maybe consider here is Chris Thompson, especially if you're in PPR. Him, Theo Riddick, Charles Sims. These guys are, they're doing work in the passing game, and that's reliable production for the most part. Those touches tend to be a little bit more repeatable from week to week and a little less game flow dependent. So keep that in mind, and use those guys if you need to. Next up, Atlanta and Tennessee. Atlanta, 4-point favorites on the road. Pretty high total here, 47.5 points. So we should expect some offense, and as such, let's play Zach Mettenberger, right? And Delanie Walker. Kendall Wright's not a bad play here either. There are a lot of bad quarterback matchups here for some of the mid-tier players, and with that in mind, that allows a guy like Mettenberger to move up the rankings a little bit, even though we can't really trust him. This is a good matchup. Atlanta has the 20th ranked passing defense in terms of DVOA, the 27th ranked adjusted sack rate. So the Titans probably will be playing from behind based upon the Atlanta offense. One guy that you absolutely have to start if you have him here is Devontae Freeman, because the Tennessee run defense is atrocious. It is the worst in the league. What that means is Mettenberger's going to have to throw, and Delanie Walker's going to catch some of those passes. There starts for me. On the sit side, I can't get behind Roddy White. I know that he caught a touchdown last week. He's shown some signs of life, but he still got out targeted by Leonard Hankerson. Julio Jones is still there. And again, Tennessee cannot defend the run. This is a Devontae Freeman game. You do not need to worry about secondary and tertiary receivers on the Falcons in this matchup. Next up, New Orleans and Indianapolis. Indy, 4.5-point favorites. Huge over-under here, 52 points. So as you might imagine, with a big total like that, we're going to see a lot of starts. Frank Gore, Dante Moncrief, Brandon Cooks, Coby Fleener. I like all these guys. Gore, part of it again is the issue with running back being such a barren wasteland, but this is a great matchup. The New Orleans rushing defense is ranked 23rd in the league, and based on this high total, we can assume that the Colts are going to be getting it into the red zone, and hopefully they'll get down to the goal line and let Frank Gore punch one or two of those in. But you know what? That high total also means passing, so Moncrief and Fleener are going to be on the radar as well. And New Orleans, as bad as their rush defense is, their pass defense is even worse. 32nd ranked in the league. That's the worst in the league. There are only 32 teams. It doesn't get worse than that. Anyway, on the sit side, Andre Johnson, kind of along the same lines as Roddy White. I just don't see him with the skill that he used to display. And why would Luck throw to that guy when he could throw to Dante Moncrief, T.Y. Hilton, Coby Fleener? Johnson's time just appears to be over. And I mean, he had that big revenge game against Houston, but this isn't Houston, this is New Orleans. And, I can't dismiss him outright because, again, the New Orleans pass defense is terrible. Andre Johnson could very well, put up like a 6-catch, 1-touchdown game and blow this projection out of the water. But, I'm trying to look at the average case. What do I expect? What should work for the Colts? And you know what? Moncrief, Hilton, and Fleener, that should work for the Colts. They don't need to rely on Johnson, and that's why he's a sit for me. Moving on to Minnesota at Detroit. The Vikings road favorites here, only 2.5 points. Pretty decent total here, 44.5. With that said, I'm a little skeptical of both of these teams just because they've at times looked so inept. Just looking at the DVO rankings, we're looking at two bad teams. Bad offenses, 29th ranked for Minnesota, 25th ranked for Detroit, and not great defenses either. Minnesota's been mediocre, 19th in DVOA, but Detroit has been abysmal, 29th. These are not great teams, and sometimes that can lead to fantasy production, don't get me wrong. Turnovers lead to, short fields, which lead to high-scoring weeks for certain players. But in general, this game, to me, has the makings of something that could be, just a lot of punting and field goal kicks. And if that's the case, you're not really going to want to be super involved with the players on either side of the ball. With that said, I like Eric Ebron here. If he starts, of course, he is, coming off an injury. But in terms of tight ends, I think I have him ranked 13th, so just outside of my top 12. But again, when you're talking about tight ends, if you can get anybody to finish inside the top 15 or the top 16, you're probably doing okay because the position is such a crapshoot on a weekly basis. On the sit side, I'm recommending against Stafford and Bell. Joique Bell, just because we don't know how healthy he is, and he's still going to be splitting time with the other backs in that backfield. Stafford, because that Minnesota defense, is okay. It ranks 14th against the pass. It's much worse against the run, 26th in the league. So I think it'll be a lot easier for the Lions to run the ball. So maybe this Bell pick isn't the greatest, but I do expect more work for Theo Riddick and Abdullah than Bell. So those are the guys you want to use out of this backfield, in my estimation. I have been wrong many, many times before. The other guy I'm sitting here is Mike Wallace. I did just get off of my Twitter feed. I was reading some interesting tweets from Mike Clay, and he was kind of making me feel bad about this pick, basically saying that Wallace is seeing plenty of targets. His target share relative to Stephon Diggs is fine. But again, this is more a call against the entire Vikings offense than it is against Mike Wallace in particular. I don't know if you can trust any of these guys. And while Detroit's defense is bad, they rank 24th against the run, 29th against the pass. You can pass on the Lions. Mike Wallace, might not be the guy to catch those passes. It might be Kyle Rudolph. It might be Stephon Diggs. It might be Charles Johnson if he comes back. So, in general, I'm not super sold on him, although this is probably the call I feel least confident in after reading some analysis from, a smart guy like Mike Clay. So, keep that in mind. You may still want to use Mike Wallace. I wouldn't bench him for just anybody, but he's probably going to be outside of my top 30 at wide receiver regardless, and that's why he's a sit for me. Pittsburgh and Kansas City are next. Had some trouble finding a line on this. I think most books were not willing to post a line without knowing whether Roethlisberger was going to play or not. I'm assuming he's not going to play and that he'll just come back next week. No over-under for the same reason. Keep that in mind. One big injury note here is Jeremy Maclin. Whether he plays or not is going to dictate a lot about how I feel about the Chiefs this week. If he plays, I'll be much more confident in Alex Smith as a 2-quarterback play and in their running game. But you know what? If Maclin is out, which he very well might be, I would probably avoid all the Kansas City players except for maybe Travis Kelce. So keep that in mind. Watch the news leading up to Sunday around Maclin and let that kind of help you make some lineup decisions for this game. Otherwise, the only start I really have here is Martavis Bryant. I think he's a top 20 receiver going forward, even with Landry Jones or Mike Vick. To be honest, I would use him. And when Roethlisberger comes back, for sure, he's a guy you're going to want to be playing. The Kansas City run defense continues to be a little underrated. They ranked 9th in DVOA, adjusted line yards 5th in the NFL. So that's defensive, of course. They're decent at stopping the run. That shouldn't push you off Le'Veon Bell, by the way. You definitely need to start Bell if you have him. But based on what the Steelers should be trying to do, it should be exploit the Kansas City passing defense, which ranks 28th in the league in terms of DVOA. So Bryant and all the other cast characters in the Steelers that you would normally start, Bell and Brown, are guys you want to use. I could even see Heath Miller performing a little bit better with Landry Jones under center. So I couldn't begrudge you for using him, although I have a feeling you could probably find a better tight end option if you look hard enough. Next up, Cleveland and St. Louis. 42 over-under. Action on the under. You don't see this very often. I try to put the VIG on here when we see it. People do not expect very much scoring in this game, and you can't really blame them considering how good the St. Louis defense is. 7th in DVOA on the season, 5th in adjusted for the preseason projections. And this might be where the wheels come off for the Cleveland offense. And for that reason, I'm saying to sit Josh McCown. I'm also saying to sit Isaiah Crowell, but that's more in terms of this start call over here. Duke Johnson, he's a guy that I think could see extra work in this game, especially if St. Louis does take a lead and Cleveland is forced to pass a little bit more. Duke Johnson, Travis Benjamin, Gary Barnidge, those guys are all going to be, I think, at least usable in fantasy, whereas Crowell could get, game flowed right out of the picture. Another sit for me here is Tavon Austin, and that in general has to do with the fact that I think that St. Louis is going to be content to just run the ball a shitload in this game. So why pass it when you can just run it? And so Tavon Austin's a sit. I wouldn't necessarily use Nick Foles here either, although the matchup isn't terrible. I mean, the Cleveland passing defense is only 16th ranked in the league, so it's not terrible, but it's not great either. They're not super good at getting to the quarterback. They only rank 24th in the league in that regard. Let's move on to Houston and Miami. Miami 4-point favorites. Decent total here, 44.5 points. I think we can channel Denny Green a little bit and say that this game is what we think it is. I think that most players that you would normally use on these two teams, you can use. Most players who are fringe or not startable are going to, continue to be in those camps. Just because these are two kind of mediocre teams battling, and Houston's definitely a little bit worse than Miami in terms of offense, but their defense is a little bit better than Miami, so I think we're going to see just a boring regular game of football here. I will say to start Brian Hoyer, the Miami passing defense is not great, 25th in the league, and they are 28th at getting to the quarterback, so I think one of the ways you can, try to put this Houston team on its heels is to rush the passer and try to get to Hoyer. But if Miami is not doing that, and again these numbers are a little colored by the fact that Miami apparently wasn't trying very hard the first few weeks for Joe Philbin. So maybe we shouldn't put too much stock into this adjusted sack rate metric because they had a lot of sacks last week. But still, I think Hoyer's a guy you can use here. He's probably a top 15 play. Again, the quarterback position is kind of a mess with a few key guys on bye and a couple other key guys in horrendous matchups. So, if you're desperate, if maybe you lost somebody or you're scrambling for a replacement for Aaron Rodgers or Andy Dalton, Hoyer might be the guy for you. You should definitely give him a look. On the Miami side of the ball, business as usual. I would use Lamar Miller. I think Tannehill will be fine. He's kind of in that 10 to 15 quarterback range for me again this week, and he'll probably stay there for most weeks just because this Miami offense does have a lot of weapons, and now that they seem to be a little bit more motivated, I think that's going to translate into not necessarily fantasy gold, but maybe fantasy stainless steel, something that isn't worthless. Let's go next to the Jets and New England. This is a pretty interesting matchup, if only because we're talking about such a prolific offense against one of the best defenses in the league. In spite of that, New England is favored by 9 points. The over-under is 48. So we should see some scoring. I mean, that's typical of any New England game. But with that said, we're talking about the Jets. We're talking about a very good defense, the second-ranked defense in the league. They are on the road, which doesn't help. And New England's defense is pretty decent too. They rank 8th or 9th, depending upon which metric you want to use. So with all that in mind, I have a feeling this over-under might be a little high, but who am I to, scoff at Tom Brady and, the FU Patriots going forward? So I wouldn't recommend betting the under, but I don't think we should be totally surprised if this game is lower scoring than we might have anticipated based upon the Vegas numbers. Anyway, starts and sits. Alluded to this earlier, but LeGarrette Blount, he's a start for me. Not a great matchup. The Jets are really good against the run. They are first in terms of rushing defense DVOA. Their defensive line, adjusted line yards, ranks second in the league. I think Arizona is the only team that's better than them in this regard. So it doesn't appear to be a great matchup for Blount, but screw it, I'm using him, man. If he's the goal line back on a high-powered offense, the over-under is 48. As much as I want to poo-poo this number, Vegas is rarely wrong. So there should be some scoring in this game. And we saw even last week, Blount caught a touchdown pass. He's not restricted only to, short yardage and grinded out football, which, by the way, this could be a pretty grinded out game considering the way the Jets play. So I think LeGarrette Blount is usable here, and I'd deploy him. Otherwise, kind of whoever you would normally start from these two teams, you got to use them. Chris Ivory, Fitzpatrick, if he's your two quarterback play, he'll be fine. Brandon Marshall, Eric Decker, these guys are, kind of no-brainers at this point. Anyway, let's move on to Oakland and San Diego. San Diego 4-point favorites at home, 47-point over-under. And I like this game for some offense. I think these defenses are both pretty bad. Actually, the Oakland defense is better than San Diego's. We're talking about the 17th ranked defense for Oakland and the 26th ranked defense for San Diego. And Oakland's coming off a bye here. They should be, well rested, ready to come out and attack this divisional foe of theirs. I think this is an important game for them, especially considering where they're at in the standings. 2-3 versus 2-4. I like Oakland in this game, probably to beat that spread of 4 points. especially, when you consider how many Raiders fans are going to be in the San Diego Stadium. We saw what the Steelers did, and, Oakland, the Raiders used to play in LA, so there's a huge Raiders fan contingent down in Southern California. Keep that in mind. This is basically going to be more of a home game for the Raiders, and they're getting 4 points. With that said, Derek Carr, Michael Crabtree are the two more fringe fantasy commodities that I think you can start pretty confidently this week. Similarly, I think Phillip Rivers and Danny Woodhead are guys that you want to use if you have them. The Chargers just can't really run the ball. They rank last in rushing offense in the league by DVOA, and that bodes well for Rivers. It bodes well for the pass-catching running back, Danny Woodhead, and it bodes poorly for Melvin Gordon, who has once again found himself on the sit side of this piece. I've tried to recommend starting him before, and it has never worked. I think he's a guy that you just kind of have to avoid until he shows us something. And, this could be the game where he does it. The Raiders' rushing defense is actually pretty good. They rank 7th in DVOA. So that's one reason why I'm saying to avoid him here. But, with that said, I can't shake the feeling that it's the Raiders, shouldn't they be terrible? But I mean, yeah, in general, I'm not using Gordon if I have him. Woodhead's the play. But that's it for this game. Let's go next to Dallas and the New York Giants. The Giants are favored by 3.5, 45.5 point over under. We're going to see Matt Castle in this game for Dallas, and there are rumblings that Christian Michael, is going to see more run here in this game. But how much? Is he really going to be a full-time starter? I doubt it. I mean, they still have Joe Randall. They still have Darren McFadden. This just screams out committee to me. And with that in mind, I'm saying you got to sit Michael and you got to sit Randall. One of these guys will probably be fine, and one of them will be usable. I'll probably have Michael ranked higher, if only because it seems in the Cowboys' best interest to give him a shot to be more of a workhorse back, because Randall has proven that he's, not great in that regard. But, Randall's been around that team longer. He knows the plays, all that stuff. And only one of them can potentially be, great. If I have to, bank on one of them this week, I'm going to have Michael ranked higher, if only for the upside. But, it would not surprise me whatsoever if Randall out-touched him like 2-1 and, put up a, 6 to 12 point fantasy day. With that said, another reason to bench both of them is the New York Giants rushing defense. They rank 4th in DVOA against the rush. So this won't be a great time to be using those Dallas running backs. On the flip side, Dallas's rushing defense is only 17th in the league, and I like Rashad Jennings a little bit in this spot. I hate recommending guys from, these three-headed monster backfields. Andre Williams and Shane Vereen are still going to be involved here. But with that said, Jennings seems to be the guy who gets the most consistent work. And this is a matchup where I think he could be usable, especially if, Matt Castle does some Matt Castle things, turns the ball over, and the Giants get up big and try to run out the clock. I mean, Andre Williams would also see some run in that sort of scenario. But that's why I'm hedging with Rashad Jennings, because I think in most game flow scenarios, whether the game is relatively close or, the Giants are winning, Rashad Jennings seems to be the guy who is the best bet for, a usable amount of touches for fantasy purposes. The other player I want to recommend sitting here is Larry Donnell. This is kind of like one of my sits from last week with Charles Clay. I don't have Donnell as an absolute, surefire stay away. He's ranked between like 14th and 16th in my rankings, I believe. You can always check those, of course, with the links at the top of the spreadsheet. But Donnell's a guy that, I just think you can do better. You probably have other options at tight end that'll be a little more reliable. Even though he does seem to be getting a little bit more of a target share going forward with the Giants. So again, he's inside that usability zone for me, but in terms of me anticipating him being a top 12 play at tight end, I don't see that this week, so he's a sit. Sunday Night Football is next. The Eagles and the Carolina Panthers. Panthers are favored by 3. A lot of action came in on them to start the week. They're minus 120 right now. So most people expect Carolina to win this game. The total is 46.5 points. This is another one that has the makings of a defensive slugfest. I do like the under in this game. The Philadelphia defense is good. They rank 5th in DVOA, 7th in Dave. Carolina's is 3rd in both metrics. So, this has the makings of another, punt fest or field goal fest. And with that in mind, I don't have any, specific starts, although I think, guys like Cam Newton, Greg Olsen, DeMarco Murray, they'll be fine. You're going to use those guys. But on the sit side, there are some guys you can stay away from. Sam Bradford is one. The Carolina passing defense is stingy enough, 3rd in the league, to merit avoiding Sam Bradford this week. There are just so many options you can find at quarterback. And they're volatile too. So Bradford could produce top 15 numbers at the quarterback position, but why take that risk against the 3rd best passing defense in the league when you could go after a guy like Hoyer or Blake Bortles or any number of other guys, even Zach Mettenberger, guys with a little bit more upside and better matchups, just a little bit more opportunity for success. And especially considering the fact that Bradford, hasn't really been that good. And there are plenty of other guys with similar talent levels and better opportunity this week or better matchups. So he's a sit. And by that token, Zach Ertz is also a sit for me. Carolina tends to be pretty good at defending tight ends in terms of fantasy points against. And I just like the other targets that Bradford has more. Jordan Matthews, Darren Sproles, even some of the other guys. Riley Cooper has been showing some stuff lately. On the Carolina side of the ball, Jonathan Stewart, Ted Ginn, I recommended against them last week. I'm doing it again this week. It's purely a matchup play. I respect the Philadelphia defense. The total here does point to maybe some higher scoring, but you never know how much these over-under totals account for defensive scoring. And I think that's something we could see in this game. Bradford throwing a pick six, even Cam Newton throwing a pick six. In general, just because there's a high total doesn't mean that all these offensive players are going to produce. You kind of have to pick your spots. Like Cam Newton, Greg Olsen, those are fine plays. Ted Ginn actually isn't a terrible play, and neither is Zach Ertz, if only because Nelson Aguilar and Josh Huff haven't done much. But in general, I think you can bet against these guys. Like I'm using Ted Ginn in a league, I just don't feel good about it, and I wish I had a better option. And that's what the rankings will reflect, and that's what this sit recommendation reflects. Last up is our Monday night matchup, the Ravens and the Cardinals. I just realized I have CAR written in here. I must have been thinking Cardinals when I went over this line, but Arizona is favored by 7.5 points, 48 on the over-under. So Vegas predicts a very nice game here for the Arizona offense, and that's reflected in my rankings. But at this point, I believe that most of the guys who we could talk about as starts are guys you were already starting anyway. You didn't need me to tell you that Carson Palmer, Larry Fitzgerald, John Brown are guys that you want to use. The running back core there is the question mark. It's like, which do you deploy? Last week I recommended David Johnson. That didn't work out. This week I'll recommend Chris Johnson. But, it really could be any one of the three guys. Johnson of the Chris variety is just the guy I'm going to have ranked highest among the Arizona running backs this week. But, the real value to be gained here is on the Arizona passing game. Baltimore ranks 22nd in the league against the pass, while they rank 12th in the league against the run. So, maybe this Chris Johnson call isn't great. Maybe I should be, promoting the pass-catching guys like Ellington and David Johnson. My problem is that how do I know which one of those guys it's going to be? I mean, David Johnson has the goal line upside, but Ellington has the big play upside. And, screw it. I'll just hedge and say that Chris Johnson, the guy who's going to get the bulk of, the normal carries, is the guy that you're going to want to use. He'll probably finish inside the top 20 or the top 24 running back this week. On the sit side, I just don't want anybody going up against that Arizona defense. Joe Flacco, Kamar Aiken, Crockett Gilmore. No, thank you. I'm not using these guys this week. Steve Smith, they'll probably be inside my top 24, but that dude is a machine. He is built to play football, and as he goes, Joe Flacco might go, but kind of what we were talking about just a minute ago with Bradford, I have a feeling that there are other quarterbacks you can find, even readily available waiver wire guys like Mettenberger and Hoyer that are probably safer bets than Flacco this week. Flacco just has too much risk of laying an egg in this matchup, and that's something you got to try to avoid. Floor does matter, especially with your starters. And that wraps things up. So thank you, as always, for watching the video. If you just read the article and you can't hear this right now, thank you too. I'm putting those good vibes out there just through the ether. Maybe you'll pick up on some. Hopefully what you get out of the written word is what the viewers get out of these videos. And I do appreciate anybody, whether it's a viewer or a reader, who takes the time out of their own personal life to check in on what I think about fantasy football. I mean, I have a lot of fun doing this, and it's an honor if even 5 people read or watch my stuff, let alone 100 or however many it may be. I don't care. It's an honor. I very much appreciate all of your time. Anyway, I'm jabbering now. I'm getting all emotional. Oh my goodness! I gotta wrap things up. Adios. See you later.